Welcome all. I would like to welcome you to Oral History at a Distance for conducting remote interviews. This is a webinar that is sponsored by the Institute for Oral History at Baylor University and also by the Oral History Association. I do want to thank the Executive Office and the leadership, Allison Tracy Taylor, Chris and Lewis, for supporting this webinar. About a week ago, I approached them about doing a webinar. It seemed to be a need in the community, and they responded and said yes. And so it's a little bit of an affirmation for us and them that 285 of you said it's a good idea. This might be something we need to have a conversation about. So we're hoping today's conversation is useful to you. I will be recording today's session. I know that for some of you, you may have to be in and out because you have other responsibilities that you're dealing with, but this recording will be made available to you, and we're going to send out a follow-up email after this session, and we'll let you know when it's posted on the Oral History Association site, so if you missed part of it, you can go check it out there, just in case. I also want to say, just to you, wherever you and yours may be in this current crisis, our thoughts and prayers are with you, and we hope you're doing well. We hope you're weathering this well. I think it's good to be together. It's good to be together and learn together. And I love that you're continuing to pursue your research aims with oral history, despite the challenges that the current crisis may be presenting us. I want to take just a minute before we get too far into the session and give you a bit of an overview of the platform that we are working with this morning. Many of you have already discovered our chat window, and you're welcome to use the chat window, which is over to the right-hand side of your screen. If you do not see a chat window, there's a little bubble at the bottom of your screen with a conversation icon. If you click on that bubble, you'll notice right now it has an orange dot on it. Click on that bubble and it'll open up a chat window over to your right. Feel free to chat in and use chat throughout the seminar. We'll use that as a way to communicate. I will let you know if you try to do private communication on it that we can see you. So just be aware that we can see you. You can select if you'd like to message just the host and presenter or all attendees. Also later on in the workshop, we're going to have a 2-hour webinar, but we're also going to have an extended Q&A conversation. I will stop the recording at the end of the webinar. We'll start a new recording for the Q&A. I'll open up a Q&A window that looks like this where you can chat in particular questions that you may have for your projects. Because there are 335 of us now in the room, I will let you know that I'll follow up with an email that will have our email addresses, all the presenters today. So if you have specialized questions that you want to handle that way, I would encourage you to reach out to Adrian or Stephen or I. This is Stephen Sloan, by the way. I'll be your MC as we move throughout the workshop and one of our presenters today. You will also see over on your right that you can give feedback. If you want to move your cursor over to the feedback window, there'll be a little megaphone over there. You can let me know, for one, if you're hearing me this morning. You can just click a green yes there. Or if you don't feel compliant and you feel like I'm going too slow, you can do that. Or if I'm going too fast, you can do that as well. But you can express yourself in a limited way over on that feedback button. So feel free to do that right now. All right, many of you found that, and that's great. I'm even getting applause. The Q&A will also be recorded, and that'll be made available as well, Gwendolyn. Just a question that you had privately that I think other folks would be interested in as well. All right, let's get going. That's us. That's me. I will confess, I don't have a suit on this morning. This distance thing does get to change how we dress, doesn't it? But this is the staff of the Institute for Oral History. That's Michelle Holland over on your far left. That's Diane Reyes, who's in the room on the far right. And then you have your three presenters in the middle, Stephen Seeloff, Stephen Sloan, and Adrian Kane. Stephen will be covering areas of distance recording and some of the logistical concerns you may have to how to record oral history well at a distance. I'll talk a little bit about oral history interviewing at a distance and some considerations that we need to make there. And then Adrian Kane will help us with some of the ethical and legal considerations that distance oral history presents. The Institute for Oral History, we're celebrating our 50th year this year in 2020. We regularly hold online workshops, and we encourage you to take advantage of any of our online workshops, whether it be just getting started with oral history or something on more of an advanced topic. Today, we're happy to partner with our professional association, the Oral History Association. I want you to meet us, but I also want you to meet the OHA. If you're not familiar with the OHA, it is the meeting place for oral historians of all stripes. And as I regularly say, oral history is a big tent. Some of you are working on community-based projects. Some of you may be interested in family history. Others of you are doing serious academic research. No matter what stripe you're from, you can find a home at the OHA. We look forward to our annual meeting in Baltimore coming up this October. But I also want to point to, and I know Adrian will do this as well, the principles and best practices of the Oral History Association. All of those are things we need to keep in mind as we think about how to work well with oral history. You can also see there's award and grant opportunities and all sorts of information, including information about the Oral History Review, our journal, and information on regional and international organizations that you may be able to interface with in your area. All right, as we jump in, we've only got 2 hours. As I said, we will be recording this. We will take a break, a 5-minute break in the middle, so know you'll have a break if you need one. And if you have to leave the session, that's okay. Don't worry if you've got to leave. You'll be able to catch up on it in other ways. Going remote. I want to talk just a little bit about this idea of going remote. We'll do this, and then we'll jump into ethical issues. I'll be back to talk about interviewing remotely, and then Stephen, after the break, will talk about technological considerations. In this moment we're in, I think if we're considering going remote with our oral history project, I think it's important to take a minute to think through the forces that are driving that decision. Is it just the crisis of the moment that's driving that decision to go remote? And what considerations does that present going remote? We're going to raise a lot of questions as we go throughout the workshop today. Hopefully we're going to give you some answers, but we're definitely going to give you some things to think about as you consider transitioning your project to a remote project. As we know, any oral history project has layers of project development. That interviewing part is part of that. And so one consideration may be, are there other things I can do during this period to develop my oral history project that doesn't involve the interviewing part? Perhaps I do need to go online and remote with distance interviews. Perhaps there are other layers of project development I can work on in this particular season. I would encourage you to weigh your options. As you weigh all the considerations we're going to lay out for you, you have the scale of your own project. And I would ask that you weigh those options, all the options that we present, on that scale of your particular project, the particular population that you're working with, maybe the timeline that you're under, the considerations that you're working with, and then determine what's best for your particular project. We want to think through elements for both you, for your research design for your project, but also for your narrators. And so that's something that we'll talk about today. What does this mean not only for you, but what does it mean for those with whom we partner? Oral history, by definition, is a collaborative exercise, and so we need to think through what this means for our narrators as well. Also, in going remote, we need to consider our outcomes. What are the outcomes from our project that we're looking for? Whether that be video, audio, transcript. What are the personal outcomes, professional outcomes we have for this project? What might be some of our narrator anticipated outcomes for this project? We need to think through those in going remote. Going remote is going to have to modify your approach. I'll go ahead and bury the lead here. This is something you're going to have to think through, and I think 400 of you in the room know that, but you're going to have to modify your approach here. This is going to be oral history in a very different way, and so we're going to think through some of those considerations today. It's also going to mean using new tools, and Stephen Seeloff's going to help us with that. Our new tool may be a familiar tool, like a telephone. Our new tool may be a very unfamiliar tool, like video conferencing platforms. So Stephen's going to help us weigh some of these new tools. Going remote also means stewarding legal and ethical considerations, thinking through what those might mean as far as privacy might go. What does remote mean? What does distance interviewing mean when it comes to legal and ethical considerations? Well, fortunately, we've got somebody who's thought a lot about what this means, these legal and ethical considerations for distance interviews, and it's Adrienne Kane. So I'd like to introduce Adrienne Kane. She is the Assistant Director of the Institute for Oral History here at Baylor University. She is a past program chair for the Oral History Association, very involved in the association as well. And she's thought a lot about legal and ethical considerations. And so she's going to think about that distance framework and then give us some guidance on what we should do. Adrienne.
All right, thanks, Sloan. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this with legal and ethical considerations for distance interviews. There are a couple of resources that you may want to have with you or may consider getting with doing legal and ethical considerations. The first is for those who are in the U.S., it's the book titled A Guide for Oral History and the Law. And that book basically is by, that book is by John Neuenschwander. Let me get my audio. 1 second. Okay, is this better? Okay, great. All right, so for those of us who are in the United States, this book, A Guide for Oral History and Law, is a good resource to have. It gives you explanations of narrator rights, sample release forms, and different ways and situations for you to handle your oral history project in a legal aspect. For those of us who are looking more on the ethical side, as Stephen Sloan pointed out earlier, the Oral History Association's Principles and Best Practices is the ethical standard for oral history projects. So you want to become familiar with those as well. They give a lot of great pointers, many of which we will go over today, on how to be ethically compliant with your oral history project. So a quick note of news with IRB review. Oral history has been exempt from IRB review, the current standing of that right now. I mean, there's quite a few things going on, but the exemption has been announced for oral history. And for those of you who are not familiar with what IRB review is, here's a quick tidbit of it. So IRB basically stands for Institutional Review Board, which is a committee that will oversee any project involving human research. You will typically see this with biomedical research and behavioral research. However, since oral history does deal with human subjects, it was kind of lumped into that category. I will say that if you have been conducting oral history and you have not run into an IRB yet, you may not have to be too concerned about this. But if you are at an institution, especially an academic institution, you just may want to be cautious and double check and see if there are any IRB rules or standards that your institution has that you need to be aware of. Okay, going on, we're going to talk about what is or what makes ethical oral history, or how can you be ethically compliant with your oral history project. And here are just a few steps for us to consider or things to keep in mind when we're doing our oral history projects. So first, you want to keep in mind what oral history means to your narrators. So for many people, this may be the first time that they're ever talking about sharing these stories or talking about the topics that you've presented to them. And it can be a very vulnerable place for them. So you want to keep in mind what it means for them to share these stories with you and to have this information documented. You want to make sure that you're being sensitive to differences and that you're not reinforcing thoughtless stereotypes. So what you want to do is you're making sure that your narrator is telling their story, describing who they are, what their experience is. You don't want to bring your assumptions into that. You also want to encourage your narrators to speak naturally. Sometimes when you're telling someone that, hey, I want to interview you, they can at times, want to put on airs or try to present themselves in their best light possible, which there's nothing wrong with. But we want to make sure that they are definitely being themselves and that they are speaking naturally and interacting with you as if it was a natural conversation. We also want to be able to make sure that we're engaging our narrators with open-ended questions and well-timed follow-through, and that we never want to argue or be drawn into a debate with your interviewee. Now, I will say with this point, with well-timed follow-through, this is very crucial when you're doing distance interviews because since you're not there with the person, your timing could be a little off. You may have to pause a little bit more or leave a little more lead time between the questions or the topics or things that you're asking your narrator because since you're not there, there could be a delay in the time or delay in the connection, and you want to try to do your best to avoid talking over the interviewee as much as possible. And the last point on this slide, you want to only make those promises that you can and will fulfill, and fulfill every promise that you make. One example I like to throw out there is if you conduct a 4-hour interview today, do not promise your narrator a fully edited transcript tomorrow. I mean, I know that many of us have a lot more time on our hands than we've had in the past nowadays, but you always want to make sure that whatever you are promising or saying you will do for your narrator, that you follow through with that and that you make sure that you fulfill that promise. So the next thing we're going to look at is a couple of basics for oral history ethics. And there are 3 main points that I want for us to look at today. And these points are for either if you're doing an in-person interview, whether it's long distance, the ethics don't change. If anything, the ethics become more important because you want to make sure that your narrator is informed and that your project is compliant. So the first thing we're going to look at is the long-range outlook. And this is like the long-term view or purpose for your project. So how do we achieve that? So first, what we're going to do is we're going to aim for the highest quality interview possible, meaning we're using the best possible equipment. We're also making sure that we're doing have well-researched questions and topics. We also want to make sure we obtain a complete record as possible. So all of our research material, all of the interviews that we're conducting for the project, we want to make sure it's a complete record. And last but certainly not least, we're wanting to protect, preserve, and archive the interview because we want to make sure that these interviews and this information is available for future research. All right, the next point that we're going to look at is correct representation, and this is the correct representation of our narrators. So what we want with this is that we want to make sure that we're encouraging free and candid responses from our narrators. Again, this is a reflection of them and we want them to be themselves. We want to follow up any responses for clarity and understanding. And this is really important because if you are conducting the interview and you do not understand what this person is saying or the answer that they've given, I can guarantee you that 10 to 15 years from now, someone who's listening to the interview may be confused as well. So if there's anything that happens or anything that is stated in the interview that you feel is unclear, feel free to ask them to clarify this or to just follow up something so that you have a clear understanding of what is being said. Also, you want to allow your narrators to review and correct transcripts or other outcomes that requires the spelling of names, places, and accurate meaning. Now, before you freak out, I've said, it's noted here that you're correcting transcripts for spellings, names, and places. This is not the opportunity for someone to completely rewrite their narrative. We're just wanting to make sure that the information that is given, names, places, etc., is correct and accurate. And as always, before you go and you quote or paraphrase any of the interview materials, just do some fact checkings first to make sure that the information that you have is accurate. All right, so we're going to move right along to what is my favorite part of oral history ethics, and that is providing informed consent. Okay, with informed consent, you're going to explain the purpose and procedures of the oral history project, along with any planned or potential outcomes, which includes any public programming, archiving, if you know that you're wanting to create a website, write a book, do a documentary, any and everything that can happen, you want to make sure that you explain that to your narrator. Now, one of the things that we go over in our Getting Started workshop is we have our participants have a homework assignment where they create a project design. Now, your project design is so important not only just to your interview itself, well, your project itself, but also it helps with informing your narrator of what you're doing, what the purpose is, how this is going to work, why they're selected as a narrator. It can help you answer a lot of those questions. And not only just with informed consent, but let's say that you're wanting to write a grant. Your project design can really be helpful with that grant opportunity, or if you're trying to get buy-in from a community, or if you're wanting to exhibit in a certain space, your project design can be very helpful with giving that information to people that you will be interacting with. So also with informed consent, you want to discuss the mutual rights that the narrator has in an interview. And we'll go over those right now. So your participants and your narrators for your project, they do have rights. One of the rights is that ownership of recorded words as an original work of authorship. They also have the right to ask and receive answers to questions about the project and procedures. And to be honest, that right there is just a common courtesy. If you're having someone who's willing to participate in your project, you should be able to answer any questions that they may have about this project. They also have the right to refuse to answer certain questions or discuss certain topics. They have the right to withdraw from the project at any time. They also have the right to review and edit transcripts, and they have the right to restrict use. So while we're talking about informed consent and providing informed consent, I know this can be a little different now that we are doing remote interviewing or distance interviews. So here are a couple of tips that I just wanted to make sure are included for you to think about or for you to consider when going forward with your projects. So one thing is that I would consider or have you consider conducting your pre-interview or at least a test run in the same manner as the interview that you are going to conduct. So for example, if you know that you're going to do video conferencing or use Zoom, for example, for your interview, to record your interview, go ahead and set up the pre-interview or a test run in that same platform. Therefore, you can guide your interviewee through the platform or through the software and let them see, things that they need to know or things that will allow them to be more comfortable with the process. So for example, kind of like what we did earlier today with WebEx. This is how you check your sound. This is how you adjust your microphone. It allows them to be more comfortable with the software or with the platform, You can also use this time to gauge the sound in the interview environment. And during the original pre-interview process, you normally set up a time where you can walk through the area and see, okay, is this a good interview space? How's the sound in this space? But since we cannot physically walk through this space, this will allow us to give that opportunity to check out the environment. So for example, is there a really loud fan in the room? Is that smoke detector going to keep going off every 45 seconds? What are some things that may have naturally been tuned out that will pick up on the recording and that you need to be aware of or maybe possibly adjust? If you're conducting a video interview, this is a great time, again, to check out the interviewee space. Again, any of those background noises. Also, any items in the background. Is there a pile of laundry that's in the back? If my camera was on right now, you would see one right behind me, to be honest with you. Are there any items that are distracting? You want to be aware of those as well. And one tip that I have for you is to take an actual photo of the interviewee or ask the interviewee for a photo if you're creating any sort of thumbnail or something to go along with your interview. I would highly avoid trying to take a snapshot of the interview because they rarely ever turn out nice. All right, so let's go back to our informed consent. So the last thing, and the most important thing I would say, is to discuss with your narrator the purpose and the necessity of a legal release form. So the legal release form has three major components, and we'll go over those very briefly today. So the three components that we're going to go over that your legal release form needs is a donor agreement, a transfer of copyright, and a future use statement. So before we go through this, I will say that the legal document often will begin with some sort of introduction or explanation of the project. Usually this is derived from, again, your project design. So this is very helpful when you're providing informed consent to your participants for your project. So for them to be able to see and to read through that with the agreement so they know, okay, this is what I am participating in and that I know what I'm signing up for. So the first part, simply put, a donor agreement just shows that there is an agreement that's been made between you and the interviewee. And what we like to use are deed of gifts. So I will say that there are several different ways or different manners that you can go with a donor agreement. For simplicity and time's sake, we're going to use the deed of gift version today. But there are several examples of deed of gifts, or I'm sorry, of legal releases out there that you can reference. You can either go on OHA's website. There are several other programs, oral history programs, that have sample releases for you to view and use. So you may want to check those out as well if you already don't have a form in place. All right, so the language is simply stating that I, the participant's name, hereby give this oral history interview to the institution or the project as a donation. So it's clearly stated there that this is a donation and that I am giving this interview to this project. The next part that we want for included in the legal agreement is a copyright transfer. And so basically this is a statement where copyright is transferred to the project. And you're probably wondering, okay, why exactly do we ask for copyright? Or if your participant asks why we ask for copyright, I'll go through it for you right now. So there are certain portions or protections given in copyright that you basically need just to simply proceed with your oral history project. So the first one that we'll go over is the right to reproduce. So as oral historians, once we have completed an interview, one of the first things that we do is what? We make an access copy. Well, that is considered a reproduction of the original work. So we need permission to do that. Also, covers a preparation of a derivative work, which is simply or could be a transcript. If we're wanting to distribute copies of the interview to the public, that is covered in copyright, so we would need permission to do that as well. And also, if you're wanting to perform any portions of this publicly or display publicly. So for example, if you know that one of the outcomes that you have for your project is an exhibit. Well, if you're wanting to display any portion of that interview or any text from that interview, that is covered in copyright and you need permission to do so. So a quick note on copyright, and this is derived from the U.S. Copyright Law of 1976. And I will say that in the research that I've done when it comes to copyright, let me go back to the last screen. These basic principles are mostly covered in different countries for their copyright laws as well. There is always some sort of protection for these rights that are listed here. I will encourage you, those that are in different countries and regions and territories, to become familiar with the copyright laws in your area so that you are aware and you're knowledgeable of what is needed for your oral history project. But back to this slide, a very quick note on copyright. And again, this is for the U.S. 1976 Copyright Act. Yes, it's very old, hopefully being updated soon. The transfer of copyright ownership must be in writing. This is very important. A verbal agreement will not suffice. It has to be in writing. Copyright ownership begins at the moment of creation. So as soon as that recorder starts and the interview begins, that is when the protection begins. Okay. The narrator and interviewer are joint authors of an interview. So for those of you who are hiring interviewers for your project, or if you're soliciting volunteers for your project, they also will need to sign a release form for the oral history being conducted. Copyright ownership also transfers to heirs. Again, this is why it's so important to get that permission from the offset with the signed release form, so you don't have to worry about later on if something happens to your narrator getting permission from their heirs. And the last one, which is one I don't really want you to worry about because it's kind of tricky, but formal registration with the U.S. Copyright Office is not required, but it is required if the copyright holder files a lawsuit for alleged infringement. And again, if we have that taken care of with your legal release form, this is something that you will not have to worry about because copyright will be assigned to you and your project. So that's just a quick note on copyright there. All right, and the last major component of your legal agreement should be a future use statement. Now, the future use statement basically covers any and all potential uses for the interview in the future. So one major example of this is like a lot of people will upload their interviews onto YouTube. Well, YouTube was not YouTube 20 years ago. So how do we prepare, or how do we think about what future platforms there may be that we will want to use these interviews for? And again, that's something that you want to think about. Now, your future use statement should be something that is broad yet specific. And the example or the clause that I have here is in print, visual, electronic, or other available media, including the internet. So that has some pretty specific uses there. However, it is broad enough to encompass any changing media or platform for the future. So this is just a look of how a simple, very, very, very simple version of how that looks all together. So I hereby give this oral history interview to the institution or person as a donation. So again, that is that donor agreement there. Now, if you go to the next section, which is that gold, it says included but not limited to exclusive rights of reproduction, distribution, preparation of derivative works, public performance, and display, which basically there is spelling out those protections in copyright. So they're giving you those rights to the copyright. And last but not least, in print, visual, electronic, or other available media, including the internet. So there you are covered. There may be some special cases with your interviews where you may want to restrict use. And here are a couple examples of those restrictions that you may have. So let's say that the person, you're creating a project and you're using these interviews for your thesis work or to write a book, and you want to say that, okay, I am using these interviews before anyone else, or once I'm done with this for my material, then they can be made public. So you want to make that, that would be an example of an exclusive use, okay? You can also restrict the type of use. So let's say that your interviewee is more than willing to participate in the project, but they don't want their interviews to be on YouTube. That is a restriction that you can set in place as well. Or let's say that you're interviewing someone who works at a corporation or is doing an institutional history, and they want to seal the interview until they're done at that job or until their term is up. So that is an agreement or restriction you can place as well. And then also you have an administrative restriction. So let's say that you are reviewing the interview and you see that there may be some information that could be harmful if released. Or let's say that someone may have released all the 23 flavors that are included in Dr. Pepper, and that information doesn't need to be out. So you could put an administrative restriction or a set time that you and your project decide on in order to keep that out for a set time. I will say that anytime that you are doing a restriction, you want to make sure that you have a safety net statement. And basically what that statement says is that you, as a project and the institution, will do everything that you can to uphold the restriction that's set in place. However, that you may not be able to support that or to uphold that against a subpoena. And what that lets the interviewee know and let you know is that you are going to do your best to uphold that restriction as well as possible, but there may be an instance where that cannot be upheld, so that there's that understanding there as well. So very quickly, I'm going to get into a couple of scenarios here that that are going to be prevalent now with doing distance interviews. So first and foremost, okay, how do I get a signed form if I can't see this person or interact with this person? Well, of course, during your pre-interview process, as we talked about, you're going to inform this interviewee about the need of the release form, okay? So what you will do is then follow up with that person and say, okay, we're scheduled to have our interview take place on Wednesday, April 1st at 2 p.m. I've attached a copy of the form that we spoke about. If please review and sign and return to me. So due to advances in technology, there are several ways that you can obtain that form now. You are able to have that person sign and scan the form back to you. I know that there's a version with Adobe Acrobat to where you can electronically sign in the actual program. This may be old school, but a fax, if you have e-fax or a fax machine, that's a way to get it as well. And then also you can always do just snail mail. Now what I will say is that if you have the person signing and mailing the agreement to you, you may want them to go ahead and take a picture or a snapshot of it and send that picture to you, just in case anything happens in the mail, or just in case you just need to have that as backup. Okay, what if my interviewee lives in another country? And this is with dealing with international interviews or interviewees. So I will state there is no such thing as an international copyright. So each region, country, territory may have their own copyright laws. So you may want to make sure that you're familiar with what those are and make sure that you know what's in place. But as I stated earlier, the copyright protections are pretty consistent of what they cover. Again, the right for reproduction, preparation of derivative work, distribution of copies to the public, and to perform and display publicly. One great resource for you to use is the World Intellectual Property Organization, and I've listed the website there as well. What they have is a database by country of the different copyright laws, treaties, amendments that have been put in place so that you can access them and be comfortable and familiar with them as well. Also, when you're doing interviews with people from different countries or in different countries, I would ask that you assess the risks of the topics that are being discussed in the interview. Is there anything being covered in the interview that could put the interviewee in potential harm? And just to really weigh the costs or the concerns with that. Also, I will stress the importance of the signed legal release form, and also that you do have the opportunity to put restrictions in place if needed. Okay, something that you may have your participant, if you're talking about different platforms, they may say, okay, what is the Zoom, Skype, Hangout, etc. So you want to make sure that you're helping your participants work through new technology. So again, as stated before, consider conducting a pre-interview or a test run with that platform, and walk your interviewee through the key components of the platform that they will need to know. Again, adjusting the microphone, how to adjust their camera or access their camera. And also you just want to make sure that you realize patience is key. If it's a new platform or something that they've never dealt with or experienced before, you just want to make sure that you're there to support them and to help them with that. And last but not least, as a last resort, and this was kind of hinted to earlier, if the platform that you're desiring to use is a little too difficult, you may want to consider a different option, and that option being just a telephone interview, something that may be simpler for them. Okay, and now we're going to talk about, okay, my interviewee may have just implicated someone of a crime, or actually I will take this even down to a lesser offense of they may have released information or revealed information that could be harmful to them or to their company, etc. So what you want to do is definitely assess the risks of the topics that are being discussed and allow the interviewee to review the interview. Sometimes people get comfortable in interviews and may release information or state things that they don't realize the consequence of until they review it. You may want to consider restricting the interview or redacting a portion if it comes to that point. And if there's anything that's really pertinent or something that's really causing you to worry, you may want to consult with legal counsel to see if there are serious concerns presented. Okay, last what I will talk about here are just a few tips for you to just keep in mind with those distance interviews. Again, the pre-interview process is crucial. So you want to make sure that you are building that rapport with your narrator, that you're going over the processes with them of what's happening and how this is going to happen. Any platforms or software that you're using, make sure that you are going over that with them so that when the interview day comes, they're not confused or worried or trying to figure out how things work. Again, you want to make sure that you get the form signed. It is so important that you get that release form. You also want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with the copyright laws to let them know, so not only that you can understand for your project, but so that you can also explain that to your narrator. Again, making sure your participant is comfortable with the platform that's being used and conducting that pre-interview in the same manner as the interview. You always want to make sure that you test your equipment and the platform. And last but not least, make sure that your interviewee looks good or presentable. And what I mean by that is if you know that you set your interview for after lunch, just making sure that there's nothing stuck in their teeth or that there's not any laundry in the background or anything that you wouldn't want yourself to have revealed on camera. So just to take a minute to set up and make sure that your video or the staging is great if you're doing a video interview. So I will close this section with ending with some resources, again, for you to consult with doing your project. So first, OHA's Principles and Best Practices. That's the ethical standard for your oral history work. If you are in the U.S., A Guide to Oral History and the Law by John Neuenschwander will be very helpful for your project. If you are needing to know or consult with copyright laws in other countries or with other territories, I would highly suggest that you use the World Intellectual Property Organization's website. They have a database there by country that allows you to access that information. And if you have any special issues, just be sure to talk to a lawyer or special counsel just to see what can be worked out and how to proceed with your project. So that is all that I have for you. I'm going to pass it over to Stephen Sloan, and he is going to discuss distance interviewing. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate that conversation of ethical and legal considerations. Looking good is a relative term. I appreciate that comment in the chat window. Again, some of you asked some great questions in the chat window. Obviously, with the number of folks that are in here right now, we can't answer these as we go, but we do encourage you to hang around for the Q&A session after today's webinar, and we're happy to answer your questions then. We'll also be distributing the slideshow from today's session via email, so we'll be in touch via email. We also encourage you, of course, you can reach out to Adrian on ethical and legal considerations. If you want to visit with me about interviewing, you can email me or Stephen Seeloff about logistics and recording. I want to take a little time. We're going to have a break here in a few minutes, but I want to take a little time to talk about interviewing at a distance and some considerations it presents for doing distance interviews. I've got a bibliography at the end of this, and so I'm going to thank a couple of sources that I gleaned some of this information from. I also want to thank Kelly Krager, who's in the room today, who's a very experienced distance interviewer with oral history at the Vietnam Center and Archive at Texas Tech University. And so we had a good visit with him and through research coming up with some different suggestions on interviewing at a distance. But before we do that, let's flash back a little bit. We do a Getting Started workshop. I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about some of the things that we focus on then, just to remind us of some of these elements of oral history that we need to keep in mind as we change the framework for oral history and go to a distance environment. We would have talked about in getting started the importance of the interviewer-narrator relationship, how to develop that relationship and cultivate that relationship. It's based on trust. It is one that is developed in the pre-interview, as Adrian talked about. It's one that's developed through the adherence to good practices. It's one that is connected to developing trust and rapport between the researcher and the researched, those that we're working with to conduct oral history. In getting started, we talk about the importance of remaining in control as the interviewer and allowing the narrator to shape the interview. You're well researched, you're well prepared. It is a guided process in conducting an oral history interview. We're letting them share their experience, but it's important to have the oral historian as guide, active and alert through the interview. One of the ways we remain active and alert is through deep listening. Actively listening to what our interviewee is saying, to what they're not saying. I would encourage you in that session to work from a topic list instead of a strict question set. You may have some scripted questions you're working with, but I really want you actively listening during the interview itself to stay engaged with what's going on with the interviewee. It's really interactive interviewing. I've got a notepad in front of me. I'm jotting down the things I want to follow up on, the things that I explore, perhaps ways in which they're defining their experience that I want them to unpack for me. Perhaps they're stating positions that I want to explore a little deeper, and so I'm going to make notes on that. They're giving me information. I am framing information and questions back to them to get a little more additional information and to allow them to explore their story even more. I'm trying to understand their perspective and their experience, and that is what this interactivity brings us there. In getting started, we would talk a lot about asking the questions, the things that we generally talk about in oral history workshops. Asking open-ended questions, asking non-leading questions. We don't ask closed-ended questions, so is it good or bad? We want people to explore the range of experience they have of events. If we were in getting started, we would talk about running the interview, making sure our questions we're asking are addressing our research topics, and we've defined our research topics well in that project design phase that Adrian was talking about. And so we want to make sure we do that well in the execution and management of the interviews. In the interview, we're watching for markers. We're looking for ways in which they may correct themselves. We're looking for ways in which they may restate things. We're looking for loaded words. We're looking for statements of self-evaluation. It's not what I always wanted, or this is what I hoped for. What does that mean? Let's not assume what that means. Let's unpack it a bit in the interview itself. And so those markers are really useful. They throw out stereotypes, or they throw out generalizations. We all use those. I want something more authentic in the interview, so I'm going to make sure I note those markers and I follow up on them in the interview itself. We would talk about digging up detailed memories, working through the elements of memory, sight, smell, sound. What are the ways in which memory are organized around certain topics? We would talk about practicing critical empathy to try to understand the viewpoint and perspective of the interviewee while holding to the fact that we can never understand it. And we're also working in such a way in the oral history interview, we're trying to get them to share their story in a way that others can understand, those not in the room, whether that be the future consumer of a research article, whether that be whatever outcome we have planned for our project. We're practicing good critical empathy in the interview itself. We're asking for elaborations. We're asking for examples. We're looking for the ways in which they can give texture to some of the concepts or ideas they're talking about, stories that represent this, memories that are connected to it. We're also using silence during the interview. Generally in face-to-face, we're letting silence work for us to encourage our interviewees to a fuller conversation and giving them a little more space to deal with whatever topic we're asking them about. And of course, in oral history, we talk about traversing difficult topics, which are the things that we want to explore with oral history, but how do we do that well, and how do we do that in a sensitive way? That could be topics that are emotionally or traumatically difficult for our interviewees, but it could be difficult, challenging topics that we need more understanding about, whatever project we may be working on. We want to address those with oral history. So those are some general thoughts, some shotgun thoughts of some of the things we deal with in the Getting Started workshop. Let's think about taking some of those things and shifting the framework in which they're done. So we're going to take some of those things that we generally are talking about in a face-to-face interview. What happens to when we move it to oral history at a distance? What happens when we take an interview or an interviewee like this and then we separate them? We're all practicing right now. We do some hardcore social distancing. We move the interviewer away from the interviewee. What happens then, and what factors are at work then? I want to start with the interviewer framework, and then I'll talk about the narrator framework, and then we'll come back and talk about logistics and interaction here between the interviewer and the interviewee and how that's changed with distance. This is obvious to a lot of you because you're considering remote oral history, distance oral history for these reasons. The cost saving that can be in place, the amount of time and money that can be saved by not having to travel for face-to-face interviews, not having to deal with the scheduling issues that can come for face-to-face interviews. And so that time and money factor is a big issue here, and we consider moving to distance. Geographic distribution, depending on how our project is organized, and again, we've got our research design done, can it benefit my project by having a broader geographic footprint? What a great example is what we're doing right now. There's 420 of us in the room, and we're from all around the globe. Does it work best for my project to have a broader geographic distribution, and can a distance framework bring me that? The pace of a project. You can speed up the pace of a project sometimes by shifting to a distance framework in gathering more data in a shorter amount of time, or from more individuals in a shorter amount of time. Scheduling also changes for the interviewer. If we think about the interviewer, they have flexibility as far as when to schedule interviews. You're not working as much with another schedule in making this happen. Safety issues, depending on some of your projects and some of the environments in which you might be conducting face-to-face interviews, perhaps this could play into it. The safety of working within a controlled context, depending on the location and the time of meeting that you might do an interview, you would be working in a very controlled context, perhaps your office or a home office. For the interviewer, distracting behavior can be less of an issue at a distance. Note-taking, which is something that can be kind of obtrusive during the interview itself, is less of an issue at a distance framework. And so we can think about that as an issue. The things that the interviewer might do, even checking the recording equipment, which is something that can be distracting in a face-to-face setting, might be less of an issue in a distance setting. Setting itself. The setting itself is more controlled for the interviewer. And as we transition to talking about the narrator, setting is an issue there as well. It's also a setting that they would generally find more comfortable because they're choosing, they have a complete choice in the setting they're choosing. Now, for the interviewer, this setting is going to present a lot of issues, as we'll see as we discuss this. As you might imagine, face-to-face, you have some control over the interview setting or ways in which you can modify the interview setting. And so we need to think about that. Susan, you asked a great great question. This is going to be different for audio only or for video only. Okay, we can think about those considerations as we go forward, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. Now, with Narrator at a distance framework, we can think about implications of this framework for them. Time and money are an issue for them as well, particularly if we're asking them to travel to another interview location. They are even being aware of preparing for an interview. What do I wear? How do I look? How do I dress? All these sorts of things could play into a different experience for the narrator with a distance framework. Again, some of this can come down differently whether we're doing audio or video. Geographic distributions, again, we can bring in narrators from all sorts of different places. The pace of a project can be quite different. In talking to Kelly Krager about one of the benefits of the narrator at a distance framework is what he'll oftentimes do in his interviews is they can go at their own pace. That's their story at their own pace. We can hang up and we can pick up the conversation again on Wednesday, or we can pick up the conversation again next week. The narrator is empowered to have a lot of control over the pace of the project, but it also gives the interviewer some flexibility to change the pace of a project. Kelly even shared someone recently contacting him and adding to an interview that they conducted in 2006. So even the interview itself can be a little more open-ended for them to add additional information into the interviews. Scheduling, they have a lot of control over scheduling. In fact, the ultimate control over scheduling, they can disconnect if they want to. So they can terminate the interview. This is different than they could do in face-to-face. They could terminate the interview face-to-face, but there's a much higher threshold they've got to get over to end the interview in a face-to-face setting versus a virtual setting. It also presents different safety considerations. So again, depending on where we might be conducting a face-to-face interview, they're in their home. There's not necessarily a stranger in their home, depending on the relationship of the interviewer to the interviewee. We can think also about distracting behavior that the narrator might do, maybe less distracting for the interviewer themselves, and this could be all sorts of different things. As we look at this, these cues that they're getting from the narrator, some of those that may be noise or not beneficial to what the narrator is trying to communicate won't be as big of an issue in a distance framework. And of course, they have total control over the setting where this interview is taking place. Now, I want to get into logistics for just a little bit, and then I want to touch on the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. The technology, of course, is a huge issue in the distance framework. Some of you are here to get an answer to that question. You've already decided you want to do remote interviews, but how do we do this best from a technology standpoint? One of the things we need to think about in the interviewer-interviewee relationship is it's made technology very central in that relationship. There are different levels of technology that you can introduce into the interviewer-interviewee relationship. There is an audio interview that can be done. There is a video interview that can be done. And then there's a distance interview that can be done. Those all have an increasing amount of technology that are being introduced into the relationship. And again, in distance, we can do audio or video with it. But technology is very central here, and technology fails can become catastrophic during an interview. We can lose. And it can also be a big barrier to the narrator ever having comfort in the interview. Technology, as you might imagine, we all have different comfort levels with technology, and there's a range of technologies that we're talking about that could be used here. Everything from an analog landline to very sophisticated video conferencing. So audio and video is a choice that you'll have to make in the distance framework. You can do audio, you can do video. We can think about the things that audio or video are going to bring us in either setting. Video, whether face-to-face or distance, is a little more invasive than audio might be. We need to think about the data that we're going to gather with video. We would do this in our project design phase and think through the ways in which video can enrich our data set, or is audio going to give us the data set that we want? We're also thinking about those outcomes that I talked about earlier. If we really need video or we need audio for this conversation. The recording equipment. That recording equipment can fail you in a face-to-face environment. But I will say this, in doing audio interviews, I've often made individuals forget that an audio recorder is in the room. I would say I've never made an interviewee forget that a video camera is in the room. And it's a challenge that the technology is central in the relationship in a distance framework. It presents some challenges for you that you need to be aware of. And so we've got to work to navigate that distance in our recording environment. We've got to think about ways to choose how we record well, and how do we navigate the conversation well that addresses some of the shortcomings of doing distance work. Of course, this, as we talked about, geographical distribution, this is giving us a wider reach. As we think about doing interviews in a distance framework, we can reach very remote interviewees. Perhaps we can reach interviewees that would be at risk or would be unavailable in a face-to-face environment. And so there's all sorts of logistics that are at work here that we need to think about. Those practical considerations Stephen will get to in a bit when he begins to talk about equipment. But I want to shift and talk about this, the interviewer-narrator relationship. As we think about ways in which this exchange, this connection or lack of a connection or connection may happen in either a face-to-face environment or in a distance environment, we can think through different elements here. There is less personal contact, obviously, in a distance environment, in a remote recording environment. So if we're working towards anonymity or confidentiality with our project, if that is part of our project design, perhaps it can be enabled in many ways by using a distance format. Perhaps, and again, the research is going to go back and forth on this, perhaps it can lead to more disclosure because more anonymity can be present. Perhaps it can decrease disclosure with some respondents. It depends on the particular interviewee that you're working with, but know this is at play as well. Privacy. We can think about privacy, the ways in which, and some of you have already brought up this conversation about safety and monitoring of modes of communication. Some can be more heightened to that actually now in a distance environment than they would be in a face-to-face environment. Okay, so we're thinking about issues of privacy. We're thinking about issues of invasiveness. And all of these, not all media are created equal, as I was talking about earlier. If we think about sensitive or controversial topics, and there's been a lot of discussion in the literature on this, and you can think of the ways in which this might happen. Things that may be uncomfortable or embarrassing, things that may not conform to social expectations, may be underreported, research has found, in a face-to-face environment. However, in a face-to-face environment, they may be willing to share some of those things that they would not be willing to share in a distance framework, in an interview framework. Empowerment. A lot of the literature will talk about this particular issue when it comes to distance recording. Those that advocate for distance recording will talk often about this issue of disempowering narrators to do distance interviews. It really puts a lot of the power in their hands. Now, this presents some complicated situations with what I was talking about earlier about the importance of the interviewer remaining in control. Okay, so we can think about that. They have the ability to reschedule. They have the ability to cut off the interview if they're remote, face-to-face. As far as a mutual citing goes, there's things that that's an Alessandro Portelli term of mutual citing. This is what's lost. This is the biggest thing that's lost in that interviewer-narrator relationship if we move from a face-to-face to a distance setting. First, in the relationship, the rapport. The building of trust and rapport can be much more difficult to establish in a distance recording environment. Although you can make the argument that they're empowered to cut off the conversation, as far as building the rapport and relationship with the interviewer, it can't happen as well through the social distancing environment. That mutual citing, all the communication part that takes place between the interviewer and the interviewee, all the data that we receive and comes in that's not just a voice speaking. That mutual citing is lost when we go to that distance environment. It's much more challenging to get. Now, some literature will make the argument that the distance environment will force your interviewees to describe things in richer detail because they don't have that other data. But other research suggests, I think more powerfully, that respondents in a distance contact are going to give you shorter responses. They're going to have less pauses in a distance environment than they would in a face-to-face environment. It's going to be hard to get past some elements of the impersonal character that comes from a distance interview. And so these are challenges that are going to be presented in this relationship. There's just less cues for understanding that are being passed back and forth, even if we're doing distance interviews in a video environment. Things that we might normally bring in are a little more challenging to bring in as far as visual aids and other things that we may want to use them to prompt memory. As I said, that third person being in the interview or the situation on the other end of the interviewee setting, we've got less control over that. And so we're at the will of whatever might be happening on the other end of the recording that we're making. So these are all things to consider. We can think about ways in which this might add some advantages into the interview. We can also think about the ways in which this is going to present some real challenges for us. A lot of those challenges come through what we're experiencing right now, and that is this issue of the social distance. So what happens when you increase the social distance between the oral historian and the interviewee? Some of these challenges that we're talking about are the things that come into place. Trust. We can think about establishing trust, establishing rapport. Are there ways in which we can build that and address, if there's a deficit that social distance brings, are there ways in which we can build capital, social capital in that area of trust with our narrators? Are there ways in which we can work against this challenge that some distance interviewees have to give longer and fuller responses, to take pauses to consider their thoughts? Perhaps it's in a serial interview format that Dr. Krager represented. It's this challenge of having less relationship with the interviewee. How do we deal with the fact that there's less relationship? We're also getting different data with this increased social distance. We can think of the ways in which this might be changing or shifting their story. that were not face-to-face. What are the ways in which it's going to free them to relate their experience? What are the ways in which it's going to challenge them to relate their experience? Research has shown that you're going to get less depth of responses oftentimes if we look at face-to-face and distance interviews straight on. And so we need to think about what that means for the ways we encourage and follow up items that are happening in our distance interviews, because we want to engage them well. Now, I've put up a bibliography here as near the end of my section, just some folks I want to thank. And again, we're going to make this slideshow available to you so you can find out more information on these. Kelly Krager, I really want to thank Kelly Krager from Texas Tech, who shared some great stories about doing distance interviews. His interviewees get real comfortable during the interview, as you might imagine. And here's a couple other resources that I would point to that are worth a read to learn a little bit more. These are not directed at oral history, but they'll talk a little bit about qualitative interviewing in a distance context. All right, as I promised you, we would have a little break. And so it is 2:12 here local time, so let's take about a 5-minute break. I know you have questions. Save those questions and we can deal with those in our Q&A conversation to come here in about 45 minutes. Up next, after our 5-minute break, is going to be Stephen Seeloff, and he's going to talk about that recording part that we want to know about, how to record distance oral history well. So let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back at 18 after the hour.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Seeloff. I am the Senior Editor and Collection Manager here at the Baylor University Institute for Oral History. Should be coming to the end of our 5-minute break, so if everyone can give me some sort of reaction in their little chat window that Stephen talked about earlier, check mark, smiley face, applause. I haven't really earned it yet, but applause is always accepted in this situation. All right. I'm seeing a lot of reaction. That's great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in to our last section today, which is all about recording remote interviews. So in this section, I wanted to highlight something first. A couple years ago, I actually wrote an article on oral history technology. And as part of that article, I wanted to have a complement online so that as technology changed, but also just to be a companion piece for the article, there would be a series of links that people could actually look at the things I'm talking about in the article. So that page exists already. It's at the Baylor site /TOHA, which is the Texas Oral History Association, because it was written for that journal, and /technology. So I wanted to highlight this link. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and bring this up on a tab. So what I did in anticipation for this particular presentation, I augmented heavily the distance interviewing section. So a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about in the presentation today have complements on this website that you can check out as I describe them, and then I'll be putting in a couple links at the very end as well about some recent conversations that we've been having online. Okay. So I'm a Bitmoji fan. There I am reading my literature. I want to start off today talking about oral history recording best practices. So some of this is the basics of what we usually talk about in our workshops about what sort of recordings we're looking for in oral history. And then we're going to use that as a jumping off point to talk about how remote interviewing impacts these decisions. So our guiding principles to begin with, and I'll kind of briefly go through this introductory section so we can get to the meat of the remote interviewing section later. So what we're looking for when recording oral history is we're recording for long-term access and preservation. That means we want preservation quality files, and we want to be able to preserve them for decades to come. To do that, we're using the best equipment we can use possible. Sometimes that's bounded by budget. Sometimes that's bounded by situations like this. What options are available to us to conduct a remote interview? We're anticipating obsolescence of both equipment and media. For the most part, what that means is we're going with the name brands. We're sticking with the stuff that we've heard of before. We're sticking with the things that are reviewed well online and that we can trust. And these days, it's not as big of an issue, but it used to be that you would run into some proprietary formats and that would really kill some life cycles of your media. But nowadays, it's pretty straightforward. And of course, we're always following this great methodology that was termed locks. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. And I'm going to talk more about locks later, about special considerations for file management when conducting remote interviews. Okay, so a little more in the specifics when we're talking about recording formats and access for oral history. For audio, it's pretty simple for us. What we're looking for in the preservation file for audio is the WAV format, the uncompressed format. And generally that means CD quality or better, 61-bit, 44.1 kilohertz. You see some 24-bit, you see some 96 kilohertz. But as long as you're starting out at CD quality, which is usually the first setting in any sort of recorder for WAV, you're good to go. Video, we're still trying to decide just what format is going to be the champion down the road. Maybe there will not be a champion, but there are several different formats that we're starting to coalesce around with our various equipment. Some of you that are familiar with remote interviewing probably are familiar with the MOV format, the MP4 format. Those are typically the ones that are auto-generated for this situation. Many remote recording apps only support MP3, and I want to hit this pretty hard right now because this is going to keep coming up in my presentation. what you'll find is there are many, many applications, whether it's on your phone or some other applications just for your desktop or laptop, that promote recording in one form or another. The very first thing you need to check is if it's recording in MP3 or in WAV format. Because if it's recording in MP3, it's compressing that audio file and you're already losing valuable data. Most MP3s are compressed at a rate of about 1/8 to 1/10 of the data size of the corresponding WAV file. So this is something I'm going to highlight later as I talk about the particulars. This other point, and it's already come up in chat a bit, remember that video can be converted to audio if your participant does not have a camera, or if you only wanted audio in the first place. So you might already have your project plan in place and saying, I'm conducting audio interviews. But you find yourself in a remote setting that maybe you don't have a landline, maybe you don't like your cellular options, and you're pretty familiar with Zoom or Skype or some other outlet. So you can either, some of these actually let you choose audio only versus video, but if you're getting a preservation-worthy video file, you can convert that over, basically break off the audio section of that and create a preservation-quality audio file as well. And then just in general, I usually say this when people are just trying to decide between audio and video in the first place. I will say budget a gigabyte per audio hour. So if you're running in WAV, recording in WAV 16.44.1, it's actually like 650 megabytes. But if it's a little higher, then it can creep up to 1 gigabyte. 1 gigabyte per audio hour is a good standard. Video hours, depending on, and this is typically if you actually have a camera you're using, anywhere from 10 to 30 gigabytes based on your HD settings. So that right there shows you're talking about 10 to 30 times the amount of digital footprint you're going to have for video versus audio that not only you will be dealing with, but your archive or whoever's taking care of your materials after your project is over is dealing with. So those are all considerations to have from the get-go. Okay, so just briefly, I wanted to throw this on the screen. This is the list that I'm using right now for entry-level professional audio recorders. So these are the recorders that have the professional XLR connectors on them so you can attach professional microphones if you so choose. It has all the settings in order to record in WAV, different formats. Usually has some great onboard microphones as well. So if you have a situation where you're sitting across from someone, you can just use the recorder. The Marantz 661 Mark III now comes with a free omnidirectional microphone, which is pretty cool. And the other cool thing is it's half the price of the Mark II when it came out. So we used to pay $700 for the Mark II model, which was our flagship model. Now it's down to around $350 for the Mark III. One other one that I'll highlight right now, the Zoom H5. This is the one I actually use in our telephone recording setup at our office right now. So the little microphone module that's on the top of the Zoom H5, that's what the audio out is plugged into, and then we're recording a telephone interview on the Zoom H5 as it's being processed through something else I'll show you later. But this has come up in chat as well right now. So the most basic option, if you so happen to have one of these audio recorders or another one on you right now that records in WAV, is that you can always record sound, whether it's from a speakerphone, landline, cell phone, speakers on your computer. You can always record that sound and you on the other end if you need to. It will sound just like it sounds right here in text. It will not be the best sound possible, but you'll sound pretty good. I mean, you're right there in front of it. You'll sound pretty good, but the other option, maybe not so good for your interviewee, depending on the connection. But that, I just wanted to make sure everybody knows that that is certainly an option. Okay, so very briefly on digital storage, this is where LOX comes into play again. And this is mainly, I wanted to hit this point. If you're switching gears now and you're going to be conducting remote interviews, your workflow for how you process preservation files is probably going to change based on whatever you envisioned or whatever you had in place before this befell us. So just keep that in mind and realize that you're going to have to consider your digital preservation workflow a bit differently. And I didn't have time in this presentation to talk about it, but in the article and in the website I promoted earlier, I talk about file fixity, checksums, proper processing of digital files, so you can read more there if you'd like. But I, again, promote locks. Backup options are plentiful these days. If you have SD cards around and you're recording on your computer, you can always kind of do the opposite. Whereas you might be recording initially on your SD card in person, you might just use them as backups for now. Portable hard drives, cloud storage. Say you have an older computer back in the ancient days where they used to actually put optical disk drives in computers and laptops. If you still have a lot of those disks sitting around, make some copies. Spread them out. So anything that you need to do to take care of your digital products now before we can get back into the normal flow of things and normal preservation practice. Okay, so now I'm going to begin getting into the remote recording equipment. And before I get to specific equipment, I've got my considerations, of course, right off the bat. And we're going to actually have a little exercise here to begin with. So the first thing I usually say when I talk about remote interviews, even if it's a telephone interview, is it's really hard to make a remote interview not sound or look like a remote interview. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share a file. It's a file I created a couple days ago that was, let's see here. It's basically intros to two separate interviews conducted for the same project. And so they're little 30-second intros at beginning parts of these interviews for a Black Gospel Restoration project. And so you're going to hear the first one that's being conducted, that's a telephone interview, and the second one is an in-person interview. So I want you to just kind of listen to it, already knowing that they're going to be different, but just to listen, and then I'll kind of explain some of the things that are happening here in this sample. Okay. Did everyone have a chance to listen to that? Did that come through pretty well for everyone? Okay. So I wanted to mention a couple things with that sample. The first thing, and this is just my experience with the sample, is that with the telephone interview, the first thing is the ability to understand what the interviewee is saying. To me, it's much clearer with the interview that's conducted in person, what that interviewee is saying than what the interviewee on the telephone is saying. Specifically, when she says the name of the song. It took me a couple listens to figure out what that name actually was. The second thing that became clear as I listened to these samples was the fact that the audio, the volume levels corresponding between the interviewer and the interviewee are different. In the first sample, you can hear the interviewer pretty well. This was one of those situations where the audio recorder is in the room with the interviewer, and then they're recording off the telephone. So he's coming through great. However, the interviewee, the decibel level is definitely smaller. It's transposed for the second sample, and generally when we're setting up audio, hopefully, in a perfect world, all audio is balanced at all times. We're masters of level balancing, and that's great. But typically, when we're promoting proper audio level balance, we tell people if you have to promote sound levels with the interviewee over the interviewer, and this often comes through like in video setup interviews and whatnot, unless you've got intricate audio mixing setups. So that really comes through in the in-person interview there, is that you can actually hear the interviewee much better than the interviewer. They're both coming through pretty well. So those are just two things to keep in mind here when we're doing distance interviews and how that can affect the audio levels at the very basic level. Okay, so moving on in this list now. So most of the equipment we have on hand that enables our remote interviews, even though it's great, we live in the world of technology, we have all this at our fingertips now, it's very basic. And then I put this little bit in here. Most smartphones have eclipsed basic laptop cameras. So if you think about the tiny little camera that's on your laptop, if you happen to have one, and the tiny little pinprick microphone that's on your laptop, and how that compares even to what we have in our pockets these days, that tells you a little bit something about the quality of the equipment that we have, and should also tell you something about the quality of equipment that your interviewees will have, because more often than not, they are not going to be pre-invested like we either are or want to be when conducting remote interviews. So your experience and your interviewee's experience will vary depending on this scenario. The other thing I wanted to throw out here is a lot of what we're talking about with audio and video conferencing via computer is impacted by internet speeds and bandwidth. And you're seeing a lot of conversations right now about the digital divide. My wife is a first grade teacher, for example, at a local public charter school. And that's something they're dealing with as well, is that she can do all this stuff from home. We've got a great internet connection. I'm using it right now. But do all of her kids and all of her families have the same? And so it's not just your scenario, it's their scenario that's going to impact the ability to actually record a solid, non-stuttered, potential disconnect video interview. So these are all things to keep in mind. Okay, so in most of my workshops, I usually talk about using a smartphone just for audio. So this isn't so much getting into like the apps and whatnot yet for call recording. This is just, hey, I've got this great piece of technology in my pocket. Can I use this as a recorder? And so I just wanted to briefly hit this and say, yes, but is usually my answer. These are the things that you would need to make that happen. Your onboard microphone, again, the newest iPhone has 3 cameras on the back. You can do amazing things these days with photos and videos. Microphones stayed about the same. So you might want to consider a microphone attachment. That's going to cost you some money. You have to think about what app you're going to use if you turn your phone into a recorder. Again, first thing, does it record in WAV? Does it record in MP3? Does it crash? This is going to be for any app that you're going to use on your phone. Most of us, app stability is much better these days than when smartphones first came out. But most of us use applications for minutes at a time. And even within those minutes at a time, they might randomly crash on us. If you're conducting an oral history interview, you're going to be conducting an interview probably getting up to an hour, maybe even longer. So stability of your application is going to play a key role here. And so it's definitely something you're going to want to test, and it's definitely something you're going to want to keep with the professionals about, so to speak. So like on the website I talked about earlier, I have some of the more standardized, like the Zoom company. They make microphones for your phone. They also have apps for your phone that work with them. So you want to keep with the name brand, so to speak. Do you have enough storage? This used to be a big problem because most people would buy a 16 gigabyte phone and half of it was taken up by system requirements. So if you have enough storage, some people struggle with storage to keep all their photos and their videos and all their apps on their phone. Again, I'm budgeting 1 gigabyte of space for a 1-hour interview if you're recording at WAV format. Do you have that on your phone, or do you have enough to conduct many interviews? Afterwards, how will you share the files? Each app does this a little differently. Thankfully, a lot of these apps these days have sharing capability through cloud applications or mailing applications, but that's something else to check. And then this is just general advice, whether you're using a phone to record an interview, using a phone to record via an app a recorded conversation on a telephone call, or you just happen to have your phone around you right now and you're going to be conducting an interview. Always put it in airplane mode. The reason is, and of course you can't do this if you're doing a call, the reason is that you're shutting off the signals that are coming to your phone, both Wi-Fi, cellular, anything that's coming to your phone. Those get picked up by other pieces of equipment. So if you have another recorder in place, if you have your computer, laptop, sometimes those can interfere with your other digital equipment, and then you don't really recognize it at the time, but then you hear it later on your recording, and you hear this interference. And that's basically the cellular or Wi-Fi data coming from a different object than your recorder. So always keep that in mind if you're using a phone or have a phone nearby. And it's also good just to make sure your phone is silent. You don't want to be that person as well. Okay, so now we're getting into some more specific equipment for remote interviewings. The first thing I'm going to hit here is USB microphones. Again, thank you to the podcasting phenomenon, and thank you to the streaming phenomenon, the YouTube stars, the gamers, because these are much more ubiquitous than they used to be. And so the one brand I wanted to highlight here, there's a lot of great brands out there, is the Blue line, and they keep a winter theme to their products. So up top you have the Blue Snowball, around $70 in a number of flavors, as I say. They come in different colors depending on your likelihood. The Blue Yeti looks more like a traditional microphone. It's a really great quality. They have a nano version now that's a little cheaper. But they also have this professional version. I actually bought a couple of these for the office, that they work for USB connections. And then also, in addition to that, they will have an XLR connector so that if you wanted to actually use it for your professional equipment, you can use it for that as well. So it's kind of like double dipping a bit. More expensive, but it works for both. The other thing you might want to consider, pop filters or the little fuzzy hats that you can get for your microphone to keep, indoors it's usually not that big of a deal, but pop filters so that you're not hitting your level marks. And then desktop arms or stands if you need to get it out of your way. But for the most part, like a stand like you see right here will get you pretty far. Okay. So now I want to talk about webcams if we're getting into the world of video and video conferencing. Unfortunately, the first thing I have to do is give you a disclaimer here at the bottom. Because everyone is working from home right now, and because everyone's trying to figure out how to do that effectively, the webcam market is pretty sparse right now. Unfortunately, the price gouging, police have probably not caught on to this fact yet, because I've seen some pretty ridiculous prices, whether it be Amazon or Best Buy or other markets, for even basic webcams. But on my website, I do have a link to 3 higher rated webcams, and I kind of categorize these as basic, advanced, and pre-lit. So basic would be this one on the left. It looks pretty simple, straightforward, $30 normally. Advanced gives you a little more of depth of view, autofocus, things like that, $70. And then they actually have pre-lit webcams these days. And I'll talk a little bit about framing your shot later. So it actually has this light ring around the camera, so you can make sure you're well lit at all times. So these are things to consider. Obviously, they're hard to get a hold of right now, so if you don't have one, it might be hard to get one right now. Most of us do have webcams that are built into our laptops. They do well in a pinch. And then if you happen to have like a cinema display, if you're on a Mac or an iMac, they might have a better camera on there as well, so that might be something you have to go with at least for a little while. And of course, I want to promote a USB headset. This will take away some of the problems that most of us have probably noticed in some of these video conferences we've been a part of the last couple weeks, whether it's echo or trying to get a clear recording one way or the other. If you've got the sound coming in through your headset or maybe even earbuds with an onboard microphone, you're going to eliminate a whole lot of that. These are still somewhat available. They start at around $30 if you look on Amazon. But one thing, if you're having trouble finding one and are willing to spend a little more money, again, thank you to all the gamers out there, because there are any number of varieties that might look a little garish to you, the colors and the blockiness of the headphone. But there are any number of varieties out there with extra buttons and extra features for the gamers. But if you're just looking for a decent USB headset, you can go this way. If you happen to have like a set of earbuds with the onboard microphone, if you're using a cell phone, that might be the way to go there. So just keep that in mind so that we don't have the speakerphone echo, speakerphone overlap issue, at least on our end. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the remote audio recording section first. And so I'm going to be talking about both physical items that can help you with these things and also software that can help you. So the first thing here are landline options. So many of us might not recognize a landline anymore. Many of us, a few years ago saw that AT&T was charging us $50 for a landline that only telemarketers called us on, and we got rid of them. So you might not have this in your house, but some people still do. We still do at our office, obviously. And so there are some options here for you to be able to grab something off a landline directly. And the one that we're using right now is this JK Audio Quick Tap. You can usually find it for around $50 or so. And what it will do is it has two, basically the phone link inputs, one from your headset, one from your phone itself. Connect on one side, and then on the output side, that runs to your audio recorder. So like I said before, we have a Zoom H5 that is running to right now, and then the landline connections are to the little box, and then we set our level on our Zoom H5, and we record that way. It's a pretty decent recording because it's direct. So it's a step above, I'd say that's a step above just putting your recorder in front of the phone and hitting speakerphone. So that's a good option. There are audio mixers. I've got a link to several, like on B&H. They get a little pricey. You can mix levels a little better. It starts to sound a little better. But again, it's the difficulty if you're sticking with the tried and true landline telephone method of getting away from it not sounding like a telephone interview. Okay, cell phone options. So most of us have the cell phone rather than the landline. So how can we use our cell phone to record a telephone conversation? So there are a lot of apps out there that will either record on your phone just whatever you speak into it, or record specifically for calls. And so right now, I'm talking about the call recorders. The number one rated recorder right now for iPhones at least is Rev. It's a free service. But unfortunately, as you see right next to Rev, MP3 only. So Rev, unfortunately, go with MP3, make it available to folks. That's great. If you just want a recording, not thinking about preservation, they're making it free because they want you to use their transcription service. So it's pretty seamless if you want to go that way and get things transcribed right off the bat. They'll do that for you for a small charge. That's great. But if you're looking to follow best practices for audio preservation, it's not going to be an option for you. Some of you might be familiar with Google Voice as well. This is available for both iOS and Android. It actually will let you set up a new number. So this is useful if you want to call a lot of people and don't want to distribute your phone numbers around. It makes it to where you can easily share the audio afterwards, but unfortunately, MP3 only again. So I've done quite a bit of research online lately, and I am still looking for a quality iOS wave recording option for calls specifically. So therefore, if there's someone in this virtual room that has one of these that they'd like to recommend, please get in contact with me and I'll update my list accordingly or share it with the group after we're done here. There are several for Android. I've highlighted a couple of these. Not only are they wave, they're free. So in some of these cases, you might have to pay a little bit to get a little extra quality, but in this case, you get both. So both of these will record a call that you're currently on. Usually how this works is you merge the call record company's line with your line, and then they provide the recording to you after the fact. So it's a simple like call merge function that they're using for something like that. The other cell phone options that are out there are actually for physical connectivity. The first one is JK Audio has expanded beyond their landlines. So you've got the cell tap, which if you still have a physical line that you can run, a lot of us are missing this jack now on our phones to it, you can use that for $100. For a little more, they have a fairly new version for Bluetooth. So you can even connect via Bluetooth to one of these little boxes, and it will behave in the same way as the original JK Audio, which runs to an audio recorder and allows you to record that way. This little guy has been around for a while, and he's actually pretty ingenious. The Olympus TP8. So what this is so this little earbud, it might just look like a standard earbud, but it actually has a microphone built on the back of it. And so what you would do is that you would put that earbud in the ear that you're holding your cell phone up to, and then connect to your audio recorder with the other end, and then you just speak like normal. And then as you're speaking, it's picking up obviously you because you're near the microphone, but it's also allowing you to record what's coming through the little speaker on your phone. This is still fairly available. It's usually $15–20, not too expensive. I have one of these at the office as well. So that's an option. So there's a good variety of different options here, whether it's software-based or physically based. And of course, a lot of this is based on whatever you happen to have already in this circumstance, or hopefully we're able to bring home with you from wherever you worked to have at home this next month or so when we're in lockdown. Okay, here I wanted to promote freeconferencecall.com. So this is audio that I'm promoting here, but it's also video. So there are models like this, like GoToMyMeeting, freeconferencecall.com, that allow you to kind of pay at what you can right now. So if you go to their website, they have different suggested monthly signups that you can use. You can even use it for free for a while if you need. And they will basically give you the infrastructure to set up what's a conference call, which for you might just be you and one other person. And they provide the service to actually record that call in either MP3 or WAV, and then send you the link to download that recording afterwards. So that's an option if you want to use your computer through that methodology to set it up, and then you could just use a normal telephone or a cell phone when the time comes to call. They also have audio calls available through their platform. So they've got a video conferencing platform as well. But in addition to that, they can record in video if you so choose, and those are available in MP4. And so we're going to talk more about the video side of things here in a second. Actually, very next slide. There I am, conducting my remote video interview with my onboard tiny little camera on my laptop. So now we're going to get into some of the things that we might already be familiar with. Maybe we have seen these on our computers already and didn't realize their full functionality, or maybe these are things that we're using a lot more in the last couple of weeks, and we're trying to figure out how this would work specifically for interviewing. So first, of course, I'm going to go through a series of tips. Always do this. So the big question here when we're talking about recording video, or even video for audio later on, is are we going to use a screen capture application, or are we going to use what's available expressly through the application itself? And so as I go through the various options later, I'm going to tell you which these are. So one of them, you kind of dictate where on your screen or what applications you're recording. The other one is just whatever natively is available through that application. This is a big one. So remember I talked about that light source webcam. So one of the reasons that's sold is to try and keep this in our heads. Y'all have probably seen, if you've done video conferences, people who don't do this. I've done this before as well as I've moved about the house here. You want the video setup to be light source, then you at your computer, and or the computer itself, and then you or your participant in that order. You do not want the light source, the main light source, to be behind the participant, because then they look like they're in the witness protection plan, and you should probably apply some sort of sound filter to their voice. So that's the general setup. Again, we're not going to get too fancy here in remote video interviewing, but if that's something that you want to go over with your participants before you get started, I think that's great. So in general, we're staying away from those backlit sources. We're staying away from variable sources. Usually that means a window, and you can't control the sun, you can't control the clouds. So every time something shifts, your light profile is going to shift. We're keeping internet bandwidth open. So for example, I am at my house right now. My wife, the first grade teacher, is at my house right now. And so I talked to her before about, okay, let's try and not to overlap here while I'm giving my webinar, so that we have plenty of bandwidth because we're using a web platform right now, to make sure everything's secure. So you probably want to do the same if you're recording from home, and want to ask your participants to do the same, if possible as well, to try and keep as much bandwidth, because we're all using bandwidth. Everybody in your house, in your neighborhood, depending on your ISP, if you're like a cable internet provider is where you get your internet from. Sometimes they have bandwidth hubs, and so depending on what's going on in your neighborhood impacts what's going on with you. So just keep internet bandwidth in mind and realize that that might impact the actual ability for you to conduct some of these interviews with your participants. And as with any bit of equipment, I would say test with your friends. A lot of these, like Skype or whatever, FaceTime, you might have already done this. Test, test, test. And then also confirm with your participants first. So Adrian talked about this, Stephen talked about this a little bit. Converting your first experience in this new remote world from interview to pre-interview, so that everyone's familiar with it. You can give some tips. We're comfortable with each other. We can see each other. We know how it works. And then the time comes, if we're actually going to conduct that interview, we've all got some experience under our belts with it. Okay, so I talked before about screen capture apps. So I wanted to highlight two in particular that are natively available depending on if you're on a PC or a Mac. The PC version is called Xbox Game Bar. Now, I don't want to scare people with that name, because you do not have to play games at all to be able to use this service. It's a very simple service for taking snapshots of your desktop if you so choose, or recording your desktop. The one on Mac is QuickTime. Most Mac users are more familiar with it. It's the very third option in the QuickTime menu, new screen recording. You set up the recording, you set up your sources, you set up either you draw a rectangle of what you want to record, or you select applications that you want to record, and you record that way. So what happens with these is that you are locally creating files that show up like in your downloads or your video folders from whatever application you might be using. And you're kind of controlling the means of production, so to speak, and you're not relying upon the application itself to produce that file for you. So we had a brief conversation earlier about certain security issues when we're doing remote interviews, and who has access to these recordings, how long do these companies potentially hold on to these recordings. Well, if you're thinking about it, if you're using your own equipment, whether it's audio equipment in front of a landline or a cell phone or on your video desktop and you're creating it on your own personal desktop, that's a lot more secure than asking a company to create a recording for you and then grabbing it from them. So that's something to keep in mind here when you're trying to decide which way to go. In a lot of cases, you'll have both options. As I said, both of those are natively available and they're free, and you just have to learn how to use them. But then when you actually get into some of this software, then the options come up as far as, okay, well, maybe they can provide the recording for me as well. So Zoom, a lot of us are familiar with Zoom now. It's really been one of the rock stars of this current era that we're going through, mainly because of its stability. I did want to highlight here that Zoom has two recording options, local and cloud recording. Cloud recording is actually only available for paid accounts. So if you get one of their free accounts, all you can do is create a local copy of your recording. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that if you have a free account on Zoom, you're limited to 40 minutes of session time. So if we're conducting an oral history interview, it might be a lot longer than that. Or you might have to think about how I can do like 30 minutes, take a break, 30 minutes, something like that. Zoom has a lot of different layouts that you can choose. The thing with Zoom is anyone who has the authority to, in a particular Zoom meeting, has the ability to record that meeting. How that recording looks is going to be based on what your layout looks like. So if we had a group interview, for example, and everybody was was recording a different layout, then we could literally have different recordings of that same interview in different layouts. So I've just got some sample screens here so you can see this pretty prominent. You could just have one screen. You can have a shared screen. You can have everybody Brady Bunch style on the screen, but it's all pretty simple. Whether you're setting it up or giving access to someone else to record, you make the choices. Again, if you're on the paid account, you'll have these choices as far as saying where I want this recording to show up. So again, security-wise, recording on your computer rather than throwing it on the cloud and you're living who knows where for who knows long is much better. Skype is another one most people are familiar with. Skype somewhat recently added native recording to their application. It's only available for Skype to Skype calls. So if you're one of those people who actually used Skype back in the day as like a phone service, this will not work specific for that, for phone calls. So this is like Skype application to Skype application call. This is one of my slides from most of my workshops, and so again, I'll hit this part pretty hard here. For all of these video options, it's not just you, it's on the other end determining the quality. So Skype, what they do is they will save an MP4 file after you're done with, so this is a screen of Skype, the little chat. So after you're done with an interview, it shows up like this, and then you can say, okay, I want to save this as whatever, and pull that MP4 off. So I think it saves for 30 days, up to 30 days in your account. So just remember to go ahead and pull that off after you're done. Skype and Zoom, they're both pretty ubiquitous when you're talking about Mac or PC, desktop or mobile. You can actually record from mobile on Skype and save it to your photo feed, your video feed, if you so choose. If you do this with these that are amenable to mobile, just remember what all of us have experiences with vertical recording on mobile devices and the black bars and how it looks. Depending on how you're oriented and working it on mobile is going to determine the final product as well. So for those of us on Macs, FaceTime will work utilizing this native. So you have native FaceTime and you have native QuickTime. And so you use those two together and you can record on Mac via FaceTime. And so this might be an option for those of us who know people who have iPhone, iOS devices. If they have nothing else with them, potentially they could set up their tablet or their phone. Your interviewee could on a desk or a stand or something like that, and that can be their recording device for them, if you so choose. You can only record, actually do the recording on the Mac, however, and it saves it in the MOV format. Okay, and then I wanted to throw out one other option out here that I've heard about a little bit, and then one of our partners, Kathleen Ryan, and I had a conversation about eCam the other day. She's used it in one of her previous projects. So eCam is a third-party solution. It's got a free trial, but $40 if you want to buy the whole suite. And it just gives you a little more as far as bells and whistles, as far as being able to be that native local recorder for anything that's on your screen, such as Skype or FaceTime calls on the Mac. And what's really cool about eCam is it will actually give you a little more leniency about how you're interacting with your inputs, both from your interviewee and your interviewer. And it also kind of dual records as the interview is taking place, so that you can not only pull a typical, what would be considered a typical oral history recording with video and or sound from both sides, but you can also download isolated recordings from one side or the other, whether it's video or audio. So if you have some production in mind already for your oral history project, that could be really useful as well. So eCam, there are a couple other third-party solutions out there like that that you might want to investigate that will give you a little more creativity to how you're going to record locally. And again, that's keeping it there, keeping it local to you and not relying on a cloud-based service. Okay. And so this is just a slide showing you some of what this looks like. There's level tracking for both sides. There's the export functions, and then also functions for interacting with online. So there's a lot to be had with eCam and similar products. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here today with some helpful resources, hopefully, for everyone to get some little further reading in, and then also to highlight some of the conversations that are going on right now about remote interviewing. Okay, so very first off, we've referenced this several times in the program already, but we really want to hit it hard here. OHA's best practice, principles and best practices document has gone through major revisions the past couple of years. Everyone should at least view them, if not print them out and have them in their binder for their project to always be able to quickly reference for whether it's interviewing or ethics or actually technologically, any questions you have there. And then even more specifically, I can highlight down at the bottom the archiving oral history section that was added and adopted this past October. So we're constantly expanding this, lots of great information to be had here. And then these two resources, these are long links, so I'm actually going to put them in the chat for you. So the first here is a link to the Google Doc that has been created by the OHA Archives Interest Group. There we go. And so this, pretty early on, when we started dealing with the remote environment, people started sharing resources. And so there's a lot of great resources already on this document for you to view and copy and check out. If you have your own experiences with remote equipment or methodology or whatnot and want to add something, please do. In addition, we also have the discussion thread that's going on at HOralHist right now. So HOralHist, if you're not familiar with it, is the section of the HNet WebServe program that deals with humanities-based discussions. And HOralHist is specifically about oral history. And HOralHist has had a pretty lively discussion thread right now. Shout out to my editors. I manage HOralHist right now. Shout out to the editors for doing such a great job right now with all the content that's coming through and getting that posted for the community. So HOralHist is another great resource, not only for this thread, but for anything that's going on in oral history. Sign up if you don't have an HNet account, sign up there, and then request for HOralHist, and we'll accept you into the ever-growing fold. I think there's over 4,000 members right now. And then to finalize things, I wanted to promote, again, If you haven't been looking at it already, check out the technology page on Talk. And then, of course, Oral History in the Digital Age kind of started this great effort to be a repository of knowledge in an online space of all things digital and oral history. Great articles, great how-to videos, great thesauri if you're kind of new into the technology, if I threw some terms at you're not familiar with. Also, recorder selection tools, microphone selection tools. There's some great filters there to decide what you want to buy, and some great reviews, most of which Doug Boyd did. I think I saw him in the chat, so shout out to Doug. And so just really try to take advantage of all these great resources that are already out there, have already been combined for the community. And that will do it for my section. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of questions out there. I saw the chat going by pretty quick, so I'm happy to answer any questions in specific you may have or further the conversation as we get into our Q&A period. But right now, I'm going to hand it back over to the other Stephen to begin our moderation of our Q&A.
I will then